Okay, now let's look at the relationship between Madaaris and radicalization. There exists this general perception or notion maybe that Madaaris are promoting extremism and radical views among their students and the people. But Madaaris deem themselves custodians of Islam and claim that they provide education that is based purely on Islamic injunctions. Now, we have to understand that this perception is actually existing not just now. It has been existing for at least 15 years, and a lot of people in general, the public at large, are growing in believing into this perception. So we need to understand, although this may be just the perception, but it is getting a lot of roots in the minds of the general public at large. During the Zia regime, the US and its allies used the Madaaris for recruitment of manpower to wage their proxy war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. We all know, we understand very clearly that in 1980s, when there was this rift conflict between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, US took a lot of support from Pakistan in particular, and in that era, a lot of investment in terms of funding, investment in terms of logistical resources were provided to the Madaaris functional in Pakistan so that the human resource there, the manpower there, can be utilized philosophically and in practice to fulfill the agendas which were not necessarily the Islamic agendas but the agendas of the international powers. By the time the Soviets pulled out from Afghanistan in 1989, many Madaaris had matured in their militant worldview. These changes propelled Madaaris from their historic role as centers of education to indoctrination centers of Islamic extremism. I don't know whether at that point of time Madaaris deliberately wanted to shift their role or not, but the history tells us that what happened in 1980s was actually quite alarming for the Pakistan Madrassa educational infrastructure. What happened was the entire shift of philosophy from providing, sharing the true Islamic values and knowledge through the Madrassa platforms was actually changed to equipping them with the rather parochial, with the rather radical, with the rather extremist mindset. There are various factors which can create extremist and radical tendencies among madrasa students. Existing biased political views, inclination and sense of superiority of specific sects, and intellectual curiosity towards jihad as a means to dominate the world are major factors that propagate extremist ideas among students. There are a lot of other factors as well, but these three which I just mentioned, they stand out to be the top factors in the shift of madrasa education more towards the radicalization. Even though the Madaaris ostensibly claim to not be directly involved in radicalizing students during education, Madaaris create a mindset to make us seminary students vulnerable to adopt footsteps of militants to join the holy war. What does this tell us? This tells us that maybe Madaaris in general are not deliberately trying to make a move towards fundamentalism, extremism, or radicalization for that matter, but through their actions, through what they are preaching to their students, inadvertently, maybe in an indirect sort of fashion, they are making students more vulnerable towards whatever we like to call as others. They are living in their particular contained sort of spheres, and they are not necessarily equipped with the ability to look beyond that. Moreover, Leaders of sectarian outfits motivate students against other sects through speeches and distribution of literature, which leads to sectarian violence. You know it as much as I know it, that there are a lot of independent organizations or individuals out there who benefit from the sectarian violence. So what they do is they do a lot of these hate speeches, and they do a lot of distribution of literature, which is basically the hate literature. Now, that was the relationship between Madaaris and the radicalization. Now, let's just shed some light. Let's just try to understand a bit more what sort of relationship exists between Madaaris and the militancy. Following 9/11, there has been a debate to differentiate jihad, terrorism, violence, and militancy, which attracts a lot of attention, particularly in conservative Muslim circles in Pakistan. Now, see, the nomenclature is very important. The vocabulary is very, very important. What has happened over the last 15 years is a lot of national and international players, good or not so good, have actually, with their speeches, with their conference discussions and debates and this and that, have actually consistently used terms like terrorism, violence, and militancy as a synonym to jihad. Now, this is absolutely not true. We need to make sure that we get this message across, and no one is more responsible for this job but the Madaaris themselves. They have to differentiate jihad from these negative, not so wanted, undesirable terms like terrorism, violence, and militancy. Many in these circles argue that if earlier the struggle of seminary students in Afghanistan and Kashmir are deemed as jihad, why are these terms now being defined according to vested interests? So in other words, if sending the seminary students for war in 1980s and 90s in Afghanistan and Kashmir was considered jihad, now why all of a sudden post 9/11 the terms are being changed? Now we need to understand jihad itself is not necessarily having the guns and the arms in your hand and you kill the people who do not, or you harm the people who do not necessarily agree with you. That's not necessarily jihad. Jihad are lots of interpretations and types. For example, the self-control is also jihad. For example, staying away or ignoring the negatives and the evils of the society, and rather adopting the true practices, the good practices of Islam is also jihad. So we need to truly understand what jihad is before getting into any sort of misconceptions, and that training needs to be given within the madrasa context. According to the research, about 200 Deobandi, 77 Ahl-e Hadith, and 23 Barelvi Madaaris were affiliated with jihadi organizations or supporting jihadi outfits in Pakistan. Lashkar-e-Taiba, for example, one of the largest and most active jihadist group involved in Jammu and Kashmir, was established in 1993 as the military arm of the prominent Markaz-ud-Dawah Irshad, a madrasa located in Muridke, Punjab, Pakistan. Some experts have also challenged the role of Madaaris in militancy. Christine Fair, for example, writes in her book called The Madrassa Challenge that the madrasa market share has remained stable or even declined somewhat since 1991. She cites studies which disagree about direct ties or direct connections, relationships between Madaaris and militancy. However, she admits even if few militants come from Madaaris, they are still a matter of concern. Madaaris also reject links with militancy, whereas on the issue of jihad, they do recognize that some Madaaris have affiliations with jihadi outfits and groups. And to be honest with you, a lot of Madaaris authorities actually publicly condemn those sort of connections as well. But what actions are being taken? that's questionable. With regard to the education of jihad, the Madaaris unanimously agree that the education of jihad is obligatory in Islam and they will continue it. To be honest with you, I do not have an issue with it. If you want to give education of jihad, you can do it. But there is one thing which needs to function as a clear distinction, and that is you or anybody out there cannot impose violence, fighting, terrorism, extremism as the only way to commit, to get involved, to engage in the jihad process, because that is not what it is. The clear distinction need to be exercised within the Madaaris as far as the relationship between Madaaris and militancy is concerned.